I'm Mark Tokola of KEI, and our topic today is the Cornwall G7, Korea in the global setting. So compared to recent years, the Cornwall G7 could not help but look like a success. The G7's been through a very bad patch. In 2018 and 2019, the G7 was unable to produce a joint communique, and in 2020 was not held at all. So although there's been some criticism of the Cornwall G7 on specifics, I think there's consensus that it achieved its general objective of trying to get the G7 back on track as a meaningful forum. Apart from the G7 members, the four invited guests to Cornwall were South Korea, Australia, India, and South Africa. The main issues discussed included dealing with the pandemic, reinvigorating and securing economic progress, the climate change agenda, and asserting the importance of multilateralism and values in international diplomacy. We are fortunate today to have a first-rate panel spanning 3 continents to help us think through the results of the Cornwall G7. Their biographies are available online, but just to remind who we have with us today, we have Ambassador Lee Hyeh-min, who's visiting professor at Hankook University, former ambassador for International Economic Affairs and G20 Sherpa. He's joining us from Seoul. From Cambridge, we have John Nilsson Wright, the Korea Foundation Korea Fellow and Senior Fellow for Northeast Asia at Chatham House. And just popping in, we have Susan Thornton, who's visiting lecturer at Yale Law School, Yale University, and former acting Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. So Susan, can I ask where you're calling in from? It's nice to know.
Yes, I'm in Maine, Mark.
Excellent, good for you. Maybe we can start with some general observations before we move into the discussion. I would encourage our audience members to pose questions using the Q&A function. They can send those in anytime, and we'll get to them later in the program. So first, Ambassador Yi, would you like to begin? What did you make of the G7 summit?
Okay, thank you, Mr. Tokola. I feel privileged to participate in the KEI conference in Korea in the global setting in the context of the G7 summit last weekend. I thank KEI for the invitation. The setback of the rule-based multilateral system under the previous administration of the United States and the pandemic have given the Cornwall G7 summit meeting renewed significance. And I'm pleased that Korea participated in the meeting as one of the 4 guests, contributing to the discussions on the current global issues. UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson extended invitation to President Moon Jae-in earlier this year. In fact, US President Donald Trump did the same last year before the summit was canceled due to the pandemic. Let me begin by sharing my thoughts why Korea was invited to the meeting. First of all, I think it is in recognition of Korea's status as one of the strongest democracy in Asia and in the world. Also, I think Korea is a recognition of the Korea's status in the world, especially in economics. It's positioned as the 10th largest economy of the world and 6th and 7th largest trading country of the world. And it's increasing active role in global affairs over the past 2 decades. Secondly, I think Korea's strong response to the COVID-19 pandemic, measured by its comparatively small number of cases and deaths, also helped. Thirdly, I think the invitation to participate in the G7 summit is the result of Korea's continued efforts over the past 2 decades to diversify its foreign policy portfolio. Korea's hosting of the G20 summit in 2010, nuclear security summit in 2012, and virtual P4G summit last month are examples of this diversification, which make Korea become a more active foreign policy player in the global stage. Finally, I think Korea and 3 other countries were invited to supplement the lack of representativeness of the G7. I agree with Gideon Lachman. a columnist of the Financial Times, who wrote on June 8th that the great challenge to the relevance of G7 is declining share of the world economy represented by G7 nations. The G7 accounted for some 80% of the world GDP in the 70s, but it is now down to about 40%. G7 is essentially a club of transatlantic democracies, but political, security, and economic center of gravity is shifting toward Asia. And for the US and Europe, China is their top foreign policy concern in these days. I think that is why Australia, India were two of the other guests that were also invited to the G7 meeting by President Trump last year and by Prime Minister Johnson this year. In short, Korea's geographical proximity to China, as well as its ideological affinity with the G7 members, may be the most important background of its participation in the G7 summit meeting of last weekend. Then, what were Korea's most relevant contribution to the summit? President Moon made a point to emphasize Korea's contribution to COVID-19 global vaccine efforts. He pledged $100 million in grants for the COVAX Advanced Market Commitment, a financing mechanism for developing countries to access COVID vaccines. He also announced that Korea would provide an additional $100 million in aid for developing countries to fight against pandemic. More importantly, Korea committed to continue to produce COVID-19 vaccines for export to third countries. From Korean government's perspective, this may be the main contribution that Korea could bring to this year's G7 summit. In addition, during the summit, Korea was actively involved in discussions about post-pandemic economic recovery, climate change, and open societies, thereby demonstrating that Korea shares the value of democracy, rule of law, and multilateralism with the United States and other democratic countries of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. John Nilsson, right, because the UK was the host, you had a front row seat. So what did you make of it?
Yes, I can't claim to have been in Cornwall, unfortunately. I was here in Cambridge watching from some distance. First of all, let me say it's a real pleasure to be here and to share a virtual panel with such distinguished speakers who know a great deal more about the intricacies of policy making than I do. But from my academic perspective, let me give you my impressions. I agree with Ambassador Lee that I think this was a really important opportunity to underscore the importance of global values, universal values, openness, and of course the sense of palpable relief that this had a normal character to it after the disturbing disruption of the last 4 years. And of course it's an interesting question, isn't it, really, whether the election of President Joe Biden will be seen by European leaders as a movement away from what might be regarded as a blip or something more fundamental, still going on within US politics. I think one of the importance of that commitment to openness and democratic values is because they are so imperiled today, even within many of the leading members of the G7. And I think that's a point that we need to keep very much in mind in looking ahead. But my general impression was that in terms of the meeting itself, in terms of the body language and the interaction between the leaders, this was extremely important. From the vantage point of Britain, for Prime Minister Boris Johnson, and Britain's commitment to multilateralism, and also as part of Britain's commitment to its so-called Global Britain strategy, now amplified and reinforced as a result of the integrated review, the meeting in Cornwall is a very important way of demonstrating Britain's commitment to a global role. Of course, hugely important in the aftermath of the Brexit decision. But unfortunately, at least seen from the UK, the issue of Brexit intruded a little bit like Banquo's ghost to complicate some of the discussions. Real tension between President Macron and Prime Minister Johnson over the question of the status of Northern Ireland. And it's an interesting question to what extent this was something that Boris Johnson deliberately sought to focus on. British columnists are divided about the nature of Prime Minister Johnson's leadership. Robert Shrimsley in the Financial Times recently referred to Boris Johnson as an inveterate gambler, and it may be a reflection of that tendency on the part of the Prime Minister to think in terms of short-term political goals as opposed to longer-term national interest-related goals. And where the issue of Brexit is concerned, I think it's interesting to point out, as the Guardian columnist Raphael Baer has described it, I think quite pithily, Brexit for the Prime Minister is not a destination, it is a state of mind. And this links to this broader question of how politics is changing, the extent to which national interest, national identity has become part of even these very important multilateral arrangements, I think is an indication of how difficult sometimes it is to move beyond the rhetoric of cooperation to the substance. And on the substance, of course, there have been mixed reviews. Gordon Brown, of course, a former British Prime Minister, came out very strongly, describing the failure to reach an ambitious agreement on vaccine distribution, a commitment to only produce 1 billion doses as opposed to the 11 billion or so that are needed. He described this as a moral failure and did not pull his punches in criticizing the assembled leaders for failing to deliver on a more ambitious agenda. If you believe some of the predictions, in order to vaccinate or in order to eradicate the pandemic by 2022 globally, you would need to see somewhere in the region of 60% of poorer countries of the world, the populations of those countries vaccinated. And that would take a massive commitment of resources. Only 1% of sub-Saharan Africa is currently vaccinated. And even optimistic assessments suggest that it will take us until 2024 to ensure a level of vaccination against the COVID pandemic comparable to Western levels. And that's, I think, a measure of the substantive challenges. On climate change, we heard, again, strong commitments from the leaders, but on the response of those organizations such as Greenpeace and Oxfam that are involved in these questions, there was, again, a palpable sense of disappointment. And as my colleagues at Chatham House, Anthony Froggatt and Rebecca Peters, have recently pointed out in a comment, there is a whole range of issues where there are legitimate questions about the ability of this important agreement to deliver, whether it's in terms of actually reducing climate temperatures, in terms of the 1.5 degree target, in terms of reducing reliance on domestic coal production. This was stated as a goal, but no clear timeline for deciding how best to realize that goal. In terms of the financial commitment of $100 billion per year to be rolled out until 2025, critics say this is simply a re-echoing of an agreement made in 2009. And even President Biden's ambitious Build Back Better global initiative, what's now being tagged by some people as a Green Marshall Plan. There are lots of unanswered questions about how this will be paid for, whether if it is presented explicitly as a rival to China's Belt and Roll, whether this will create hesitation on the part of some countries that don't want to be seen as being part of an adversarial dynamic with China. So important symbolism, but again, the devil really is in the details. And on the issue of values, my last point, I think it's striking the extent to which there has been a strong commitment to emphasize the importance of shoring up democracies and resisting authoritarianism. But certainly, at least based on the press coverage, there seems to have been a divergence between the United States and, to a lesser extent, Britain, which I think shared Washington's view on the importance of dealing with the elephant in the room, the China question, and those European countries, for example, Germany and Italy, that are hesitant about being seen as being trapped in a more adversarial relationship with China. And it's for that reason that there was a reluctance to single out China in terms of the language of the joint communique, with the exception of those critical issues such as Xinjiang, the security and peace and stability of the Taiwan Straits, and the broader issue of human rights. But on questions such as forced labor, much of this was couched in more generalized language. And even on the part of British officials, press reports suggested that for the United Kingdom, it's more important, in the words of one official, to emphasize what we are for rather than what we are against. Lastly, on the question of Korea, I think, again, to echo what Ambassador Lee was saying, hugely important. Some would say perhaps overdue, given Korea's economic status, given its very clear ambitions as a middle power to occupy what I would describe as the sort of policy entrepreneurial space in a whole range of important diplomatic areas, whether it's strengthening relations with Southeast Asia, for example, through President Moon's new Southern policy, and because of the many areas, not least in tackling the pandemic initially, but also in terms of using its science and technology and its digital technology to enhance cooperation with other countries, including, of course, with the United Kingdom. And last but not least, I think the Koreans will have been reassured, of course, by the important statement coming out of the summit on North Korea, a commitment to complete denuclearization, but also, interestingly, a nod in the direction of diplomacy, which suggests that there may be room at some point, should conditions between Pyongyang and Washington improve, for a resumption of more effective dialogue. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Susan Thornton, I think John correctly raises the question of unfinished business. If the G7 had been the last word, I think there'd be a lot of grounds for criticizing it. The big question is whether there'll be progress going forward if the Cornwall summit was the beginning of something. So from the U.S. perspective, what do you make of it?
Well, thanks so much, Mark, and sorry for popping in a bit late. I did have some technical issues this morning, but it's great to be with all of you. Good to see you, Ambassador Lee, and good to be with you too, Nils. I think on the U.S. front, what did Biden have to do in this meeting, and did he do it? He had to show that, the U.S. can show up at a meeting, get along with people, be seen to be cooperating, reassure the allies that the U.S. is going to play a role, a leadership role, a responsible leadership role. And I think certainly that he did do that. Biden is very, very good at these leader-to-leader interactions. He knows all these people. He likes this kind of meeting setup where it's, a chance to have informal side conversations, et cetera. So it was the first in-person meeting after COVID. Of course, the setting was beautiful. The family members, some of them were there, and they had, a lot of good coverage and color. And I think it sort of showed a positive signal after coming out of COVID. The other thing that he has to do, of course, is show that the U.S. can lead in a global setting. And here, I think he also did a good job on this, or as good as he, as well as could have been expected. Let's put it that way. I mean, there is a lot of confusion, I think, coming out of the summit. And I do think they could have set expectations a little bit more clearly going in. When I look at the 50-page long communique, it's kind of a typical gibberish of wonky Washington sounding things that isn't going to mean anything to people, outside of the working groups and committees that put that thing together. So, it would have been nice to have like a one-page clear statement of what this was about, because the thing that I see in diplomacy and in these international meetings is the disconnect really between what happens at these meetings and sort of, average people in these countries that are frankly, all of us have tough politics right now. And Biden's answer to that is his foreign policy for the middle class. I mean, I didn't see, frankly, a lot of foreign policy for the middle class at this meeting. And I think one of the things that the G7, or maybe it's going to be the G10, I don't know, has to address is, what are they doing to make the world more fair? I mean, this is the thing that people are upset about. and why people are skeptical of these kinds of meetings and Davos and all the other things that happen in these international circles that people don't really understand very well, but it doesn't ever seem to really do anything for them. And the one thing I have to say I was a little bit disappointed about, and others have alluded to this, is, this was supposed to be the COVID summit. It should have been the COVID summit. This is the biggest crisis the world has faced in, since I can remember, frankly. I mean, the upset to every country in the world is just palpable and not really, just because we in the US are feeling a bit more optimistic about it, other countries are going into their second wave and feeling very down about it. And it should have been enough for this summit to focus on that. But instead, it seems we have a very difficult time prioritizing and setting expectations. And I think this gets to the issue of sort of Biden being a man in a hurry. He feels like he has to tackle so many things. He's certainly under siege at home, in the sense of domestic politics is really dogging him. And he's trying to put together a very significant domestic agenda and, not being helped out at all by his opposition party. So I think, he did a good job in being statesmanlike and showing that the U.S. wants to cooperate, but I would rate it as less good on the sort of connecting what he's doing to, average people in America and average people around the world. And I think the G7 really has a responsibility. I mean, this is what they bill themselves as the countries that are responsible for leading, for filling the gaps, for, helping out poorer countries that are struggling. And, I have to agree that I'm not really sure on the big issues, sort of COVID and vaccines is clearly the biggest issue. Whether the contributions there come through as stingy or as, convincing that we really want to do something. On economic recovery, the Green Belt and Road competitor, I just don't think it's going to stand up to the light, frankly. And then on the last item, the climate change item, I agree there was sort of not a lot of prominence given to that issue and not clear that they really made, a lot of progress on that issue. And certainly with Australia at the meeting, it detracts a little bit from their ability to reach a quorum on that issue. So, we can talk further about the China issue, but for me, it's really this issue of sort of, this is a club of rich democracies, let's face it. And as was mentioned by Ambassador Lee, shrinking sort of global influence on the economic stage. So what is it that they really are going to do? And if they're going to make themselves into a club and be against everybody who doesn't think like them, I don't think that that's going to bring us the kind of sort of reform in the international system that they claim they want to pursue. So the values agenda, of course, is important, but making it, an exclusionary versus an inclusionary litmus test is I think going to be a real problem. And it's a tension in Biden's foreign policy, to be sure.
Yeah, I agree with you, Susan. The communique was encyclopedic. I mean, I just set aside time to read the whole thing. It almost felt like there were 3 or 4 years of piled up issues from the previous G7 failures to have a communique. It all got tossed in the pot at the end. So there was a lot there. And in terms of the sense of the G7 too, I think one of the questions we have is what's the difference between the G7 and the G20? What are their distinctive and unique roles? How do they cooperate or work together? I've got a few questions I'd like to pose, maybe starting with Ambassador Yi. Will President Moon's participation in the Cornwall G7 help him promote his domestic economic agenda at home in Korea? Did the summit meet Korea's expectations?
Before I answer your question directly, I would like to say that I and other Koreans are happy to witness the revival of the multilateral cooperation. Particularly myself, I was present at 3 consecutive G20 summit meetings as Korea's G20 Sherpa, 2015, 2016, and 2017. I could witness stark difference of atmosphere of the meeting. was the representative of the United States. Totally different. Therefore, I'm happy to see the revival of the multilateral cooperation because I believe the world would be much different now if we, an international community, had responded to the pandemic at its initial stage in a similar manner of cooperation coordination we can see at the G7 summit meeting. And as we did regarding the financial crisis of 2008, I think I'm happy to see the multilateralism and international cooperation have come back. In view of the fact that more than 90% of Korea's GDP is generated by trade, a stable and prosperous world economy is essential to Korea. Therefore, we welcome the G7 plus 4 countries agreed to work together to beat COVID-19 with the goal of ending the pandemics in 2022, in particular by accelerating the provision of vaccines to most vulnerable countries, despite critical and negative appreciation of that commitment. Ending the pandemic lay a strong foundation for reinvigorating world economy and to promoting the growth in the future, substantially benefiting Korea. If I say one more thing about the positive one, is that President Moon could have another good opportunity to renew his cooperative relations with President Biden and to reaffirm that Korea is an ally of the United States and that our two countries could work together to address issues of global concerns as well. Finally, as a member of the G20, which is a premier forum for international economic cooperation, Korea and other G20 members can contribute to enhanced communication and joint work between the G7 and G20. To achieve the goal addressed by G7 plus 4 leaders, we need definitely the participation of the G20 countries because currently global issues cannot be fixed without them. I believe the enhanced role of Korea in the world stage would definitely help President Moon to promote his domestic economic agenda at home as well. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with you completely about the multilateralism aspect of the current environment in diplomacy. When the pandemic was spreading around the world, I kept wondering where the G7 and G20 were. When were they going to meet, say something, do something? So it is a welcome return. John, turning to you, hosting the G7 summit gave the UK an outstanding opportunity to highlight its post-Brexit role on the world stage. So did the summit help clarify how the UK wants to be positioned now that it's outside of the EU?
I think that the difficulty for the United Kingdom in a way echoes Susan's point about this sort of enormous long laundry list of ideas that are embodied in the communique. It's very hard to see how Britain breaks through with a clear sense of mission. And critics, including former permanent undersecretaries at the Foreign Office, have often made the argument that the rhetoric of global Britain is not being translated into a clear agenda. And even if you look at the integrated review, for example, this effort to come up with a coordinated statement of strategy, it has a similarly ambitious reach to tackle multiple issues. So it's actually very hard to see what Britain stands for. And in some cases, there are real tensions and contradictions. And I'm afraid I have to come back to the character of Prime Minister Johnson, who is perceived as being untrustworthy, with good reason, both at home and abroad. And I'm not sure that this summit, particularly with the surfacing of the Brexit issue, will have dispelled that sense the Prime Minister as something of a kind of temperamental gambler. I suppose climate change, of course, is the one area, looking ahead to COP26 in Glasgow, where you would expect Britain to be taking a clear lead. But again, it's the failure to provide details. I think seeing real progress in terms of financial commitments ahead of COP26. There are some specific recommendations in the joint communique referring to mandatory financial disclosures for climate-related policies, which are small, but again, are not going to capture the imagination. And on the question of Britain's role post-Brexit, of course, it's trade that is so critically important for the United Kingdom, having lost our market on the European continent, or at least having seen it compromised as a result of Brexit. We've seen the attempt to compensate for this as a result of the UK-Japan Economic Partnership Agreement, similar discussions now with Korea to solidify something comparable, but it's only going to deliver very modest economic gains at the in the best possible circumstances. So Britain has a long way to go to provide that degree of compensation, if you like, for the loss of the European market. On strategic issues, I suppose the more forceful language, particularly as it relates to China, even if it was not perhaps as ambitious as President Biden might have wished, if the reports are to be believed, resonates with some changes we've seen, I think, in Britain in the last few months. There is, I think, a growing appetite to take a more hardline position on China. We've seen that in Parliament. The chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Tom Tugendhat, for example, has been quite outspoken on China issues. I think there is an increasing appetite to take a tougher position. Hong Kong, for example, of course, has particular significance for the United Kingdom. But even if we are moving away from what David Cameron referred to many years ago as the golden era in Sino-UK relations, Britain too, like other European countries, has to be careful because, of course, China remains economically important. And amidst all of this talk of a tougher position on China, even the Biden administration, of course, has said, cooperate where you can, confront where you must. And I think we should be wary of assuming that this is a zero-sum choice. But again, from the communique itself, perhaps that message hasn't been delivered as clearly as it could have been. And Britain, in a way, was, because of its dependence on the China market, notwithstanding its concerns, would have been in a good position to have emphasized that point. So I would say we should be cautious at this stage about assuming that Britain has really set out its stall very clearly, but Prime Minister Johnson will have been relieved that the summit itself went smoothly and avoided, with the exception of the Brexit discussions, any major rifts.
Thank you. And Susan, I'll kind of pose the same sort of question to you regarding the US positioning on global stage. As you mentioned, President Biden seemed very comfortable being back into a multilateral setting with people he knew personally. But he seems to be having to strike a balance too. So how does he strike the balance on two fronts? One is trying to appear to be a cooperative partnership ally while trying to assert US leadership. And what about the balance at home? Is he restrained by the need to look like he's also putting America first in what he's able to do multilaterally?
Yeah, I mean, I did touch on this a little bit, in my earlier, answer, this issue of the sort of foreign policy for the middle class and how do average Americans relate to all of this. I mean, I do think that the juxtaposition of the G7 meeting and then the NATO meeting and then the meeting with President Putin of Russia, was a good sequence for Biden. It showed that he can work with our allies and partners, but he also has the stature and the statesmanship to feel confident enough to reach out and have a meeting with President Putin, with whom we've had so many difficulties in recent years. So I think that was, a good staging and sort of effective for the two aspects that Biden wanted to show. He wanted to show that we can get back to diplomacy, that he's going to not be afraid to have conversations with people and try to get progress on practical problems, even if we have differences with counterparts. And I think that was effective, and he needed to demonstrate that back at home too, because I think the American people, are, if nothing else, signaling that these kind of foreign military adventures, I mean, this has been signaled now for years by elections in the United States, that that really we're not that interested in having a lot of difficult military interventions overseas, but that we need to get back to finding effective tools to solve problems short of the military tool. And so I think the reach out to President Putin was effective with that. I do think that on the G7 summit, there was this difference in emphasis. Really, it was pretty stark going in. The UK briefs before the meeting were very focused on COVID and COVID recovery. Other European leaders were focusing on COVID recovery, economic recovery, and climate change. The troika that the Biden team was briefing before going to the meeting was COVID, economic recovery, and China, and it was a pretty big difference in the sort of setting out the expectations for the meeting. And I think the Biden administration probably made a mistake in briefing so much ahead of time that this was going to be the summit at which we all come out, against China, because that isn't really where we are as a world right now in the midst of this pandemic. And it did feel like it was a little bit of a disconnect. I mean, certainly there were things in the communique that came out and showed, this new skepticism about China and determination to push back on some of the behaviors. But, clearly there were a lot of differences that came out on this in the summit, which weren't aired in specific terms, but you could tell from the briefings that different people gave that there were a lot of disconnects on that. And with President Macron coming out in his post summit press conference and saying, this is not an organization hostile to China, I think that sort of reflects a little bit the disconnect or the difference in emphasis between the U.S. and its partners on making this summit about China, which was not really where everyone else was. And, this reflects Biden's domestic difficulties. Again, maybe he wouldn't have preferred to have to carry that China baggage into the summit, but this is sort of what he's determined is the connective tissue back home to get his domestic agenda through, I think. And so he needs to carry that with that banner with him now everywhere, even if it seems a little bit, inopportune or something. So that's kind of how I see. But I think he did a good job of again, sort of showing that balance. I do think, they talked a lot about humility, in the early days in office, needing to be humble. Biden said, he wrote this article before he came, it was before his inauguration, where he said something like America is back at the head of the table. That didn't go over so well in Europe. And so now you just hear him saying that America is back. We need to build back a better world, this kind of thing. So I think they've adjusted some of that, maybe less humble kind of utterances to a place where it sounds actually, I think, pretty solid.
Yeah, before I turn to Ambassador Yi with an economic question, let me pose a quick follow-up to John on this one. European commentators have expressed concern that Trumpism, or even Donald Trump himself, could return in 2024. So does the thinking that there's a need to hedge against that get in the way of current cooperation?
I don't think so. I don't see any obvious sign that this is leading to any hesitation or reluctance. In fact, I think going into the summit, Prime Minister Johnson had reasons, given the position of Ireland, actually, and if one thinks back to the campaign and candidate Biden's Irish connections, there was a lot of concern that this might be an issue between the two men, but it was, I think, neatly resolved in terms of the public statements about Ireland that surfaced during the summit. And of course, when it comes to thinking about transatlantic cooperation, we've had a lot of discussion again of the importance of the so-called special relationship. In interviews that the Prime Minister has given, Johnson has been quick to underscore the importance of cooperation with the United States. And of course, the historical roots of that relationship are so strong. No British Prime Minister, I think, would in any way want to modify or qualify that. I think also, I mean, we're seeing in terms of British foreign policy, our own version of a pivot, if you like, however overused the phrase is, in terms of a much clearer commitment to the Indo-Pacific. Flotilla of ships, at the heart of which is Queen Elizabeth II, is en route to the region. That's a very important symbolic commitment of Britain to regional security. But it again comes back to the question that Susan was raising. How do you persuade public opinion in the United Kingdom to endorse these sorts of ambitious operations? Because it takes resources and capabilities. How do you convince the British public, which has been so preoccupied with the Brexit debate, that it is appropriate for Britain to take on this much more conventional, ambitious role as a maritime power in this region, however important it is economically to the United Kingdom? Sometimes I think there is a sense of historical dissonance. And Prime Minister Johnson, I think, amplifies that because of his tendency to wrap himself in a kind of a type of Churchillian set of rhetoric that seems historically at odds with our much more modest role in the world. I think Robin Niblett, the head of Chatham House, I think put it quite well in a recent report that we published, where he talked about Britain needing to play the role of being a broker rather than great power. And I think sometimes there is an appetite on the part of the Prime Minister to try and seize this great power role, which is at odds with public opinion. It is at odds with our basic reduced status as a much more modest power off the coast of Europe. And so I think we need to think quite hard about how we allocate our resources. But of course, when it comes to relations with countries like Korea, this opens up opportunities because in a sense, we are much more aligned in terms of our relative status in the world and our relative capabilities. And we should be working, Britain should be working, I think, quite deliberately to enhance that relationship with Seoul.
Ambassador Yi, there's a great deal of emphasis at the Cornwall G7 on infrastructure investment, on the global tax system, and on new technologies, but perhaps less on trade and investment policy. So how do you interpret the signals coming from the Biden administration on how it will conduct its trade policy? What would Korea want to see from the US, either in regard to WTO reform or regional cooperation?
Okay. I think the most imminent question facing us regarding international trade system is now how to resolve the issue of paralyzed dispute settlement mechanism of the WTO. I participated in the Uruguay round negotiations, and when it was finalized in 1994, newly established dispute settlement mechanism with the appeal system was appreciated as the crown jewel of Uruguay round negotiations, which was only possible to begin and to finish with the strong leadership of the United States at the time. It's really ironic that this dispute settlement system was collapsed by the United States 25 years later. I'm disappointed to find the leaders have not sufficiently addressed WTO reform issues, and G7 communique just briefly touched it as if it were not of importance to the economy. Together with increased regulations by states in order to cope with COVID-19, the fight against climate change also requires more intervention by the state. Therefore, I can say that invisible hand of the market is now giving way to the visible hand of the state. In this context, Korea is concerned with the possibility of increasing government subsidy of the advanced economies. As you witnessed in the course of US-China trade negotiations, the subsidy issue is the red line for China. And it seems very unlikely that China may agree to new international subsidy rules jointly proposed by the US, EU, and Japan. Therefore, I'm worrying that the United States and European Union and Japan will offer the subsidies to their own industry in order to combat China's state capitalism in the coming years. Good example is the increased subsidy of European Union for the development of electric car battery and the plan of the subsidy provision by the United States and Japan to their companies. This race to bottom of international trade rule breaking must be addressed with immediate action on WTO reform in general and on its dispute settlement mechanism in particular. In order to demonstrate that US returning to the traditional US foreign policy of supporting and strengthening the rule-based international order, a policy position that has faced very serious challenge under previous administration, Biden administration needs to more actively and progressively and positively engage in WTO reform, starting from the normalization of appellate body. It will be an important way to restore the confidence of the world in the leadership of the United States for promoting the rule-based international order, despite the constraint of domestic politics, that the trade policy is not a popular topic and does not generate the supporting votes in the elections. It is all the same around the world. But I may add one more thing about the Brexit and UK trade policy. It is quite impressive that United Kingdom has concluded free trade agreement in 50 countries in a year time. But it is very impressive quantitatively, but not qualitative, because the UK's FTA with Korea, Japan, and other countries are just the cut and paste of already existing those countries' FTA with the European Union. The global Great Britain declared that they can conclude FTA with US, China, India, ASEAN, and other countries, with which European Union could not conclude the deal. But what about the US-UK FTA? I think it's not possible in near future. What about China? No way. India, even though the UK and India have agreed to begin their negotiations, will be a long way to go. Therefore, I think it's a really dilemma. It will be a big dilemma for UK government to realize how difficult it is to conclude the trade agreements, because in trade negotiations, it is a give and take. European Union has much more to offer than UK, because UK trade system is one of the most liberalized one in the world. So they have nothing to offer. That is the dilemma. But as John mentioned, the positive aspect of Brexit is that the UK participation in the like-minded countries grouping, including Korea, Japan, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, will get more political weight. Therefore, those countries, together with the UK, can play a kind of brokering role between the US and European Union? Thank you.
Yeah, that's very helpful. I have to say that of Biden administration's foreign policy, the part I understand least well so far is trade policy. I think it's yet to be defined. We have audience questions coming in. Unsurprisingly, they're almost all focused on China. So let me kind of group them and pose it to Susan, if I may. A lot of discussion about the G7 was about how it would deal with China. I mean, I found that to be a bit exaggerated. The G7 countries have a lot of common challenges in trying to navigate a post-pandemic global environment not related to China. But still, China seemed to be front and center. Does even the appearance of a toughening G7 attitude toward China make diplomacy with China easier or harder?
Well, thanks, Mark. And that's a really good question, and it's a really tough question. I mean, I think, diplomacy with China is harder because China, has gone through a pretty tumultuous period in with the United States over the last 4 years, and that's really continuing, I think, under the Biden administration, as the Biden administration really doubles down on emphasizing this great power competition with China in the context of almost everything it's trying to do domestically. And I personally think that's a deliberate decision that reflects our politics. And so it's not that surprising that that's not completely reflected in other capitals that are dealing with China, coming from a different perspective, a different set of constraints, et cetera. I think China responded to the communique, of course, in pretty harsh terms. They criticized the mentions of China in the G7 communique. They said that, the G7 isn't making decisions for the world anymore, sort of reflecting that the G7 is a little bit, behind the times, I think, is the way the Chinese would put it. And I think, the thing that's really, I think, pretty worrisome about where all this is going, and is the question of whether you can have a group of countries that are like-minded and want to stand up for their values and promote them, as the G7 countries all do, and have this kind of idea of democracies banding together to make democracy more resilient, to strengthen democracy, to shine the beacon to the world about our values, our protections for human rights, our democratic systems, while at the same time not, upsetting the prospects of progress around strengthening the rules-based order. Because let's face it, most of the countries in the world are not in this club that I just mentioned. And so, Ambassador Lee just talked about the WTO and the World Trading System. The problem is going to be sort of how to get things that the G7 wants to do, adopted and pursued in an era where their kind of collective clout is diminishing. And they have to also sort of be pragmatic and reflect a realistic assessment of, how things are developing in the world. And I think that Ambassador Lee mentioning that the G7 is now including a number of countries of Asia is part of this reflection of new realities, the shifting power in the international system, but it's not a complete realization. And from where I sit, I think the G20 is it's a much more cumbersome organization to try to deal with. It's new, it doesn't have a secretariat. It's hard to deal with countries that are not like-minded. But I think the G7 needs to start thinking about how it comports itself within the context of the G20. I mean, a G7 could come together, or a G10 or subsets of the G7, not necessarily all those countries, could come together and lead on various issues and then bring them to the G20, where they could be, put forward in a more reflective of global realities venue. And, this tension between the G7 and the G20, frankly, I think is unhelpful. And the G20 has kind of been subordinated, certainly under the last 4 years of the Trump administration, not gotten a lot of attention and not gotten much done, as you mentioned. But I think that's a mistake. I think the creation of the G20 and the elevation of the G20 in 2009 by President Obama was exactly the way, we should be going. And we seem to be having a difficult time committing to actually adjusting to changes in the world. We keep going back, maybe because of nostalgia or something, but we really do need to move forward and try to figure out how to get things done that are going to actually solve problems that people care about in the international system in order to make it relevant to all of our populations again. So that's sort of what I would see in the China issue coming up is part of this. I mean, of course, they like multilateralism. They're in the G20. And, as I think Angela Merkel said in her remarks, without China, we can't do much. So I think, that sort of reflects a lot of sort of what the reality is out there in the world. And if we're just in denial about that, we're not going to get very far.
Mm-hmm. I've got a related audience question for John. Both the EU and NATO are preparing to issue major global strategy documents in 2022. So did the G7 and NATO meetings provide any indications of how Europe is going to treat China in its planning going forward?
Well, they certainly, I think the NATO language with a line in the communique talking about China's ambitions and behaviors as a challenge to the international rule-based order, and the fact that Secretary General Stoltenberg has essentially said that the G7 nations are stepping up to take a more assertive position on China, prima facie seems to suggest a shift in mood. But of course, there are countries in Europe, particularly in former Eastern Europe, countries like Hungary, which are heavily dependent on trade with China. We know that the Germans and the Italians are reluctant to see tougher language. And even, even at the NATO summit, despite this sort of new willingness to talk about China, it's important not to see NATO as somehow developing an Indo-Pacific identity. I think it's more a reflection of the importance of addressing China's rise as an economic and strategic competitor. There were some things, I think, which came out of the NATO summit that do suggest a more pragmatic approach and a shift to address issues that are new. One, of course, is the possibility of using cyber technology under the terms of Article 5 to address threats to the resilience and integrity of our own domestic societies. And I think this is to go back to Susan's point about sort of authoritarian democracy binary. I mean, it's sometimes presented, according to the rhetoric, as if the threat is coming from outside. I think we forget the extent to which the threat is also internal. And there are practical challenges about how you cooperate with apparently like-minded countries. Take India, for example. The world's most populous democracy, and yet headed by a leader who has practiced a form of exclusionary Hindu nationalism that is arguably at odds with some of these very democratic values that are being trumpeted in the statement. And it also relates, I think, to the importance of creating a foreign policy for the middle class. It was Jake Sullivan's article in the Atlantic in 2019 that I think made the case that foreign policy needs to be used as a tool to legitimize democratic values at home. That's the challenge. How do you create free and open societies or maintain them while at the same time dealing with people's disaffection with globalization itself? I mean, the argument for why populism has become a phenomenon of such powerful impact is partly because people have lost faith in internationalism. And I think that's the really pressing problem. Allied to that is the idea of how you can marry both confident national assertiveness with internationalism. And there are some leaders, I think, who recognize that intuitively. President Macron, I think, for example, is, in his embrace of French cultural revivalism, is in a sense trying to say you can be both a good patriot rather than nationalist, and at the same time a good internationalist. But that's a very difficult message to sell to domestic opinion. And we see the tension between those two issues occurring in so many different situations, not just in Europe, but I would allude to East Asia, tensions between Japan and Korea, for example. There was a lot of hope at the G7 summit that there would be a formal meeting of some sort between President Moon and Prime Minister Suga. It didn't happen. The fact that it didn't happen is a reminder, I think, of how difficult these issues are to tackle.
Our time is drawing to an end. I've got one final question, I think, for Ambassador Yi. And the question is, does Korea want to become a permanent member of this G7, 8, 9, 10, or is it content to be a frequently invited guest?
You see, I was a G20 chef. I work for G20. And you see, the traditional, formally structured international government organizations are established by a founding charter or international treaties, such as Charter of United Nations or the Articles of Agreement, IMF. By contrast, neither the G7 nor G20 is founded on a constitutional document. Therefore, both are informal entities. When it comes to membership, there is always a dichotomy of efficiency versus representativeness, legitimacy. The smaller the group, the more efficient it is likely to be, but smaller groups lack adequate representativeness. I think it remains to be seen whether all G7 members will continue to acknowledge the need for their group to be more geographically diverse and economically representative. This will determine whether Korea, as well as other guests attending last weekend's summit, become permanent participants in the G7 in the future. For Korea, however, I would like to stress that it is not a big issue for Korea to be a member of the G7. I think the important issue is for Korea is how to make more active contribution to the global governance by participating in the dealing with the global crisis through a steering committee of the global governance, whether it is the G7 or G20 or any other forum. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a very good closing comment, I think. We covered an awful lot of ground in 1 hour. There's a lot of policy content here. So all that remains for me to do is to thank our excellent panelists for a very good conversation, to thank our audience for sending questions and for watching. And I'd like to invite the audience to please keep track of our activities at KEI on the website, which is keia.org, where you'll see news, commentary, and announcements of upcoming events. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.